Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, welcome. Good morning. Welcome and to the first meeting this year in Brussels of our delegation. Wir haben Übersetzungen in English, Finnish, French, German, Italian and Polish. The next time we will have it also in Russian. No? Ich möchte ganz herzlich bei uns willkommen heißen den Botschafter Russlands bei der Europäischen Union, Herrn Tschitschow, und den Botschafter der Europäischen Union in Russland, Herrn Uschakas. Herzlich willkommen beiden, dass Sie heute hier sind. Die Anwesenheit beider verspricht neben der Realität, die uns täglich begegnet, eine spannende Diskussion. Ich möchte Sie fragen, ob Sie Einwände gegen die Tagesordnung heute haben. Dem ist nicht der Fall. Dann ist sie so genehmigt. Und ich komme zum Punkt 2, den Announcements des Vorsitzenden, und möchte hier zwei Aspekte anschneiden. Zum Ersten, das heutige Meeting unserer Delegation war ja geplant als ein Preparatory Meeting unserer geplanten Reise vom 16. bis 18. Februar nach Moskau, wo wir ein Büromeeting zwischen dem Büro des Interparlamentarischen Ausschusses der Duma, EU-Russland und unseres Büros vorgesehen hatten. Aufgrund der gegenwärtigen Situation, besonders angespannten Situation zwischen der Europäischen Union und Russland, hat die Konferenz der Präsidenten entschieden, dass diese Reise zu verschieben ist und eine endgültige Entscheidung erst in den nächsten Wochen fällt über diese Reise. Ich möchte aber in diesem Zusammenhang sehr deutlich sagen, dass der Wunsch und der Wille der EU-Russland-Delegation des Europäischen Parlaments, des Büros und auch meiner Person, unsere Arbeit und unsere Verantwortung nach bestem Wissen und Gewissen wahrzunehmen und die Reise im vorgesehenen Format so bald wie möglich durchzuführen, aufrecht bleibt, weil wir der Auffassung sind, dass man jede Form der Kommunikationsmöglichkeiten und des Dialoges nützen sollte. Das Meeting am heutigen Tag ist eine gute Möglichkeit, sozusagen einen Überblick zu schaffen über die aktuellste Situation in den EU-Russland-Beziehungen. Leider hat sich seit unserem letzten Meeting nichts zum Positiven verändert. Und daher ist mir auch wichtig, dass wir heute darüber diskutieren, was kann geschehen, damit wir, und was muss geschehen, damit wir zu einer positiven Veränderung der Beziehungen kommen. Ich komme damit zum Punkt der Einleitung zu der heutigen Diskussion. Wir können sagen, wenn ich nur den heutigen Tag hernehme und die letzten Stunden, dann gibt es, wenn ich nur 4 Beispiele erwähne, dann gibt es ein positives Signal und 3 Rückschritte. Das erste ist, das positive Signal ist, dass das Verbot von Memorial in den letzten Tagen nicht ausgesprochen wurde, was aber noch nicht heißt, dass der besondere negative Status von Memorial und damit die Arbeitsmöglichkeiten von Memorial verbessert wurden. Aber das Verbot wurde nicht ausgesprochen, was ja anstand. Darüber sind wir froh. Wir wollen auch, dass die Arbeitsmethodik von Memorial so vom Staat her gesichert ist, wie es einer unabhängigen, für eine unabhängige, objektive Menschenrechtsorganisation und NGO in einem Land gebührt, die Mitglied des Europarates ist. Kommen wir zu den 3 negativen Entwicklungen. Das eine ist, Sie wissen, dass der Berichterstatter des Europäischen Parlaments, EU-Russland, Herr Landsbergis, nicht nach Russland einreisen durfte, obwohl er dort nur hinfahren wollte, um mit Menschen zu sprechen, die ihm helfen können bei der Berichterstattung, bei der Erarbeitung des Berichtes. Er durfte nicht einreisen und seine Mitarbeiterinnen und Mitarbeiter haben kein Visum erhalten. Das Zweite ist, es wurde im Europarat gestern im Europarat die Entscheidung getroffen, dass das Stimmrecht Russlands im Europarat weiter die Entscheidung über das Stimmrecht auf April hinausgeschoben wurde. Russland daher weiter kein Stimmrecht im Europarat hat. Und Russland hat entschieden, dass sie an keinen Aktivitäten bis zum Jahresende, bis zum Dezember im Europarat teilnimmt. Brauche ich nicht jetzt darüber zu reden, dass das Minsker Protokoll nicht angehend umgesetzt wird, dass wir eine verschärfte Situation in der Ukraine haben. Mich stimmt das eigentlich sehr, sehr traurig, weil ich nie aufhören werde zu hoffen, dass gemeinsame Verträge und der politische Wille zum Gespräch angespannte Situationen ohne militärischen Einfluss beseitigen kann und wir wieder zu einem tragfähigen Miteinander kommen. Denn jeder Tag, wo sich die Spirale des Vertrauensverlustes verstärkt nach oben schraubt, macht den Weg zurück schwieriger und wird auf beiden Seiten die Missverständnisse positiv formuliert und die Gegenreaktionen erhöhen. Das können wir auf diesem Kontinent nicht gebrauchen. Es widerspricht auch allen unseren internationalen Verpflichtungen. Ich möchte daher jetzt die beiden Botschafter bitten, aus ihrer Sicht die aktuelle Situation, wir alle beginnen ja nicht bei Null, zu schildern. Den Botschafter Russlands bitte ich vor allem auf das inakzeptable Einreiseverbot von Herrn Landsbergis einzugehen, weil ich das Gefühl hatte, dass sich hier auch etwas verändert hat. Etwas verändert hat in den Beziehungen. Das ist für uns als Parlament nach dem Einreiseverbot der Rebecca Harms das zweite Mal, aber jetzt in einer offiziellen Funktion, nämlich der Erarbeitung des Berichtes. Das ist für uns inakzeptabel. Aber ich würde beide Herren nicht nur sagen, was alles zur Verschärfung der Situation beigetragen hat, sondern auch, wo Sie ein, zwei Möglichkeiten der Lösung sehen. Ich bitte den Herrn Botschafter Hitschov, seine Position zu präsentieren, dann den EU-Botschafter in Moskau, und dann können wir in die Diskussion eintreten. Ich danke Ihnen, dass Sie alle hier sind und bitte Sie um eine konstruktive Debatte. Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to find out that Russian is not yet a language which I can use in this room, but I'm heartened by the prospect outlined by Mr. Karas that soon this possibility will be available. Anyway, thank you very much for this opportunity to address this open session of the group, and I'm always ready and willing to meet with members of the European Parliament and other interested people, as I have been for the last, it's already more than 9 years that I'm here in Brussels. We've seen good times, we've seen not so good times, ups and downs in Russia-EU relationship. There was a period when I compared a strategic partnership to a pebble, as round from frequent use, I mean the term, and as difficult to grasp. Unfortunately, recent events have shown that this pebble has been falling out from our hands, and I would today compare a Russia-EU relationship to a prickly stone like an asteroid flying through space on an uncharted route. But leaving romantic romantic connotations aside, let me stress that there are many factors which describe the nature of Russia-EU relationship, and I believe that strategic partnership, however you view the term, is not just a theoretical possibility, but a practical necessity for both sides. Russia and countries belonging to the European Union are part and parcel of Europe. So no matter what happens to our relations at any given moment, we will be forever united by geography, by shared history, by mutually complementary economies, and millennial ties of language, religion and culture, and, of course, by common responsibility for peace and security on our continent. Indeed, our relationship is going through difficult times. There has not been a single event, a single activity in Russia-EU relations that has been frozen or otherwise cancelled by the Russian side. The specific issues that Mr. Karas has been referring to, I will certainly give you my reply. But on a more general framework, there is an ongoing, very fashionable debate regarding Russia's supposed detachment from European values and principles. I think this debate is a false and deeply misleading one. Most, if not all, countries of the European continent abide by the same legally binding code of standards, namely the European Convention on Human Rights, as well as the politically binding acquis of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. How these norms are translated into reality is a different question. No country in the world, I may add, is above reproach, EU member states included. However, for the record, let me state that Russia has always been a stout champion of these values and principles. The EU, on the other hand, is apparently having second thoughts about acceding to the European Convention on Human Rights, as the recent ruling by the European Court of Justice seems to indicate. The ongoing predicament between Russia and the West has within its narrow focus the current conflict in Ukraine. Recognizing the extent of the tragedy which has unfolded in that country, allow me to stress that in our view, the current crisis of Russia-EU relations has its roots in a much more systemic problem. Contrary to expectations, the fall of the Berlin Wall 25 years ago did not herald the establishment of a common European house. Exclusive clubs of influence like NATO and the EU endured and sought to extend their geopolitical influence. We have witnessed attempts to resolve complex issues in Europe and elsewhere through interference in the internal affairs of states, destabilization of elected governments and military coercion, all in violation of the UN Charter and the above-mentioned OSCE principles. No wonder that division lines and confrontational stereotypes continued to linger. Sadly, and I agree with Mr. Karas's description of the current situation as sad. Sadly, Russia-EU cooperation has not escaped this overall drift in Russia's relations with the West. There are many indications that this drift started long before the crisis in Ukraine unfolded. Let me give you just two examples. One, let me refer to 2003. Romana Prodi, who was then President of the European Commission, heralded that in 5 years' time, Russian and EU citizens would be able to freely cross borders without visas. And the same year, this goal of a visa-free regime was agreed as a long-term goal in our bilateral relations. Yet in recent years, negotiations on this noble objective hardly progressed, and since 2012 we have been waiting for the EU to agree on an updated version of the 2006 visa facilitation agreement, which would have allowed to reduce bureaucratic red tape for travel of representatives, and take note, of civil society, journalists, scientists and athletes. Not only did the EU fail to summon the required qualified majority of votes in the Council, but over these last couple of years we were faced with additional preconditions and artificial linkages of the agreement with totally unrelated aspects of Russia-EU relations. Secondly, in 2010 at the Russia-EU summit in Rostov-on-Don, we have sought to place bilateral cooperation in the area of crisis management on a firm legal footing. Such a step would have allowed Russian and EU military and civilian units to swiftly deploy together to hotspots across the globe, avoiding protracted parliamentary wrangles, with all due respect to parliaments, of course, on approving foreign peacekeeping interventions. Surely acting in unison to contain emerging threats to international peace and security would be in the interest of both EU and Russia. Nevertheless, in practical terms, the EU has proven unable to move beyond a pre-cooked one-size-fits-all approach. And this in spite of the EU having agreed back in 2008 that joint Russia-EU crisis management would be enacted in the spirit of equal, and I stress the word equal, partnership and cooperation. I've singled out these two cases for obvious reasons. They are largely devoid of politics. They draw on competitive advantages available to both sides, and Russia and the EU would have stood to gain from enhanced cooperation in these areas. Let me now try to attempt to chart a way forward for Russia and the EU. Above all, it is imperative to advance towards a swift resolution of the Ukraine crisis. The current flare-up of fighting in Donbass is certainly a cause of serious concern. It is beyond doubt that the authorities in Kiev have used the recent ceasefire to regroup forces and have not abandoned the ill-conceived idea of achieving a military solution to the conflict. It is an established fact that Kiev has been procrastinating with its response to President Putin's initiative dated January 15, 2 weeks ago, on the withdrawal of heavy weapons from the line of contact. Let me be absolutely clear. The Minsk agreements, including provisions on ceasefire, heavy arms withdrawal, political dialogue, measures to alleviate the humanitarian situation and promote economic recovery, must be adhered to by all sides of the conflict. The number one objective is to put an end to hostilities and resume the so-called silence regime. With this in mind, we count on the European Union to do its part in containing the party of war, the so-called party of war in Kiev. This can hardly be achieved through blanket support for everything the Ukrainian government is currently doing. It is up to our partners to persuade Ukraine to finally start along the path of a genuine and direct dialogue on constitutional reform with the involvement of all regions and political forces. Such a dialogue would lay the groundwork for national reconciliation and in time for a viable Ukrainian state in which all its inhabitants would feel protected and comfortable. Obviously, the path of unilateral sanctions, which I would call a road to nowhere, must be abandoned if our relations are to regain a sense of normality. The gloating heard from some quarters on how Russia's economy has been affected by Western sanctions is misplaced. To most analysts, it is beyond doubt that the sanctions campaign has significantly damaged the EU's own ability to escape the vicious circle of economic malaise, deflation and unemployment. Many European companies have invested billions of euros in the Russian economy and have earned an excellent reputation and operated successfully in my country. Now they are forced to incur losses or give up their market share. Make no mistake, I like this expression by President Obama, make no mistake, Russia will not be drawn into a tit-for-tat discussion on criteria for waiving EU sanctions, which we consider to have been illegitimate in the first place. The ball is firmly in EU court. It is reassuring that many high-ranking EU officials have started pondering an exit strategy out of the sanctions impasse. But we know how EU machinery works, and we do not have false expectations. We will certainly be closely following internal deliberations ahead of the European Council meeting in March. The recent hideous attacks in Paris have once again highlighted the real threats and challenges that European countries, both members of the European Union and those that are not, are facing today. There is a growing awareness that the scourge of international terrorism, financed through organized crime and drug trafficking, can only be tackled collectively. Over the years, Russia and the EU have constructed a network of mechanisms of cooperation between their security, military and law enforcement agencies. Yet today, unfortunately, because of the EU's position on the Ukraine crisis, this joint work is frozen. Meanwhile, terrorists have not stopped cooperating. Russia and the EU are actually facing an arc of terror along our common southern periphery. It is only reasonable that we start acting as adults and reopen all channels of communication, something that could contribute to saving the lives of our citizens. But above all, Russia-EU relations beyond the Ukraine crisis will need to acquire a degree of ambition and strategic horizon. Even in spite of current tensions, Russia has not abandoned the long-term goal of establishing a free trade area between the EU and the newly established Eurasian Economic Union. Naturally, we must be realistic. At this time, the prospect of a single economic and humanitarian space from Lisbon to Vladivostok may seem a distant one. But perhaps a goal like this would be worthy of the historic role of today's generation of Europeans. Nowadays, against the backdrop of the Ukraine crisis, there is an inclination by some in the EU camp to renounce the normalization of relations with Russia as business as usual. Ironically, this is a point on which I happen to agree. A return to habits of the past will not remove the underlying reasons for the current escalation. If our relations are ever to be deemed strategic, they must finally begin to rest on sound principles of genuine equality, mutual respect, and shared responsibility, and I repeat that, for our common neighborhood. Now the specific issues that Mr. Karas has been referring to. On memorial, actually the Russian Supreme Court has issued a ruling overturning the previous decision on this NGO. So the issue can be considered closed. On Mr. Landsbergis, your colleague, let me correct you. It was not a case of him being prevented from entering the Russian Federation. He is free to enter. He is not on any stop list. And he has a Lithuanian diplomatic passport and thus enjoys the possibility to travel without getting a visa. Unlike, of course, his two collaborators, one a Lithuanian citizen and the other a French one, who needed their Russian visas that were not really not issued because the timing of the visit was very unfortunate. First of all, practically all the people he wanted to see in those days were traveling to Strasbourg for that ill-fated session of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And secondly, the Duma reacted in a way to that decision that Mr. Karas had referred to earlier, to cancel the planned visit of the Bureau, meeting of the Bureau of the of the Parliamentary Cooperation Committee in Moscow. I spoke indeed to President Martin Schulz of the European Parliament twice, and he explained to me the reasoning behind that, which is slightly different from what has been announced. Anyway, it's not an issue of closing the door for dialogue. It's an issue of the need to prepare such a visit in due course and choose proper timing that would suit both sides. On the decision taken in Strasbourg by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and the decision of the Russian delegation not to participate, not in the Council of Europe, no. On the government side, full cooperation is continuing, and the current President of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, the Belgian Foreign Minister Didier Reynders, confirmed that. So it's just a decision which had been announced earlier, that should the Parliamentary Assembly take that vote, the Russian delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly will not participate in its deliberations until the end of this year. And finally, on the need to talk, I think in my introduction I've fully supported that. We are working on promoting our political dialogue. We are willing to find solutions to problems that may arise, and I think Russia and EU will gain a lot from closer cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you. I will not react in this moment to your speech. Our next speaker is the Ambassador of the European Union in Russia. I will inform you that I have 20 members on the speakers list after your speech. We have time till 11:30. I hope I can ask everybody to give his statement, and we have enough time on the end to react. Herr Botschafter, bitte.
Dankeschön. Thank you very much, Honourable Chairman, for the opportunity to address the Chamber. It's a great pleasure to be here with my homologue and friend Vladimir Chizhov to debate on the current state of play of relations between the EU and Russia. I'll try to focus on three issues. First, what happened. Second, I think it's important to understand why did it happen. And the third, which is most difficult, is what to do. I mean, it's clear that last year, in 2014, with the illegal annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation and destabilization in eastern Ukraine, the European security foundations were shaken, and interdependent relations between the EU and Russia were disrupted. A year and a half ago, before going to assume the post in Moscow, I addressed the Honourable Chamber of AFET in speaking before you and discussing relations between the EU and Russia. Some of you who have participated will vividly remember that at that time the main sound bites were about strategic partnership, about 4 common spaces, about partnership for modernization. Immediately with the illegal annexation of Crimea and the destabilization of eastern Ukraine, the house which we have attempted, and Ambassador Zhov has mentioned, to build together suddenly collapsed. Our strategic partnership and our 4 common spaces have been replaced by sanctions. However, it came not out of the blue. The stones started to erode earlier, and the clouds started to gather before 2013 or before 2014. It was already demonstrated through the reaction to Bolotnaya events on the 6th of May 2012, clashes and protests, arresting the people who protested for the certification of Duma elections. Different perceptions to the role of the civil society have clearly demonstrated the different views, the different positions we have when it comes to relations between the citizen and the state. Secondly, of course, our hopes which we have developed with the Russian accession to the WTO have not been honoured, and instead of greater access to the Russian market, our businesses have encountered protectionist measures, and at the moment we have 4 cases in the WTO vis-à-vis Russia. And of course the tipping point in our relations, as I mentioned, was Ukraine, annexation of Crimea and destabilization in eastern Ukraine. But I think it's very important, and I wanted to share with you how much the different narratives and public perceptions have impacted in a different interpretation of events and further deterioration of the conflict. I think it's important to know that for us, for the European Union and for the West, Ukraine is indeed a sovereign, independent country with all international institutions which we expect to be respected by everyone. In Russia, by and large, Ukraine, yes, it is a sovereign country, but not exactly. It is a part of a greater historical legacy, and that matters to the Russian state. Eastern Partnership for the EU is seen and has been as a project of promoting democracy, the rule of law and good governance, projecting stability. For Russia, it's viewed as a geopolitical project, interfering with a perceived legitimate zone of Russian interest, a kind of a zero-sum game, unfortunately. Maidan, for many of us, resembles Solidarność movement or Sąjūdis movement like in Lithuania. In Russia, I'm always confronted with the narrative that Maidan is a CIA-organized conspiracy with the EU flags in front. On one thing, although we do agree that what happened in Maidan might be perceived differently, but it turned into a massive national uprising against a political corrupt regime of Ukraine. Sanctions for the EU are not against people, they are not aimed at weakening the Russian state, but changing Russian government behavior when it comes to the foreign policy with respect to Ukraine. While for Russia, our sanctions are perceived as aimed at a regime change and weakening Russia. True, it is important to know that during President Medvedev's presidency time, Russia has made an honest attempt to accede to the international system based on international law and its economic system. However, at some stage they felt the interests were not taken in proper consideration, even though they made attempts towards modernization and open borders, as you mentioned. When facing the reality, it was realized that Russia was not ready to tackle the challenges of a true open society, of a true open free market, and unfortunately they stepped back. So what is the impact? What is happening in Russia? We see that while the European Union economy is on the recovery path, and we anticipate this year positive growth in all EU member states, the interdependent Russian economy has entered a period of recession. International financial institutions currently project the GDP of Russia to shrink in 2015 by about 3% or even more. While there clearly is not a single factor causing a precipitous fall in economic activity, the more than 50% decline in the oil price since June 2014 was indeed most important. Secondary contributing factors were falling investors' confidence since the onset of the crisis in Ukraine. The net capital flow last year summed up to a record of $151 billion. The restrictive measures imposed by the US and the EU on Russia's financial institutions and on Russia's oil industry, and past failure of the Russian government to have enacted structural reforms leading to liberalization of the economy. As First Deputy Prime Minister Shuvalov recently noted in Davos, Russia is facing much greater difficulties than the global recession some 7 years ago. On the other hand, it may consolidate Russian society around the government to carry out so much necessary reforms. Anti-crisis plan of government will inject $41 billion or 4% of GDP this year, but it is still unclear how fundamentals of the economy will be addressed. It is also important to note that there was an impact, of course, for the EU businesses, as Honourable Ambassador Chizhov had mentioned. Russia has become not the third but the fourth trade partner of the EU, after the United States, China and Switzerland, while the EU still remains the largest partner of Russia. We have not received the final data on our trade volumes, but it's clear that our trade will be declining by a margin of 5 or 10%. We've seen that the demand in the market has also declined, especially it's witnessed in the cars industry, between 10 or even 20%. And just today in the BBC, some of you heard that Carlsberg is closing 2 factories in Russia. It is important to note that the impact on the population and the response of the population is the following: that faced with the current challenges, Russian society has reacted by demonstrating its historical known resilience and rallying around President Putin's policies. Support for President Putin has increased to 85%, and the propaganda machine has proven its effectiveness. The West is perceived as unfriendly to Russia, and further deterioration of Russia's economic situation is likely to increase policies of demonizing the West, resorting to enmity and confrontation, and it's already often seen on the media the West and European Union presented as a scapegoat for all the bad things what is happening. Furthermore, while with good news on Memorial, we're witnessing and remain deeply concerned about shrinking space for civil society, human rights defenders and the free media. And civic society is not to be seen in Russia as in competition with the state, but rather as playing a complementary role. NGOs are called and financed to play a social role, bearing the feelings of civic duty, patriotism, sacrifice in the interest of the state. And NGOs' interference into the intra-party politics is considered inadmissible, and we can see that trend further promoted. It is also worth to note that, as a fact that the Eurasian Economic Union has been launched as of 1st of January, and it remains to be seen how it will develop, while we also note, of course, some difficulties and disputes which occurred when Russia has introduced additional barriers, or inspections at least, on the border with Belarus. So now we move to and also the idea of pivoting towards the east is not a new in the context of current political juncture, and this direction of relations with China and Asia at large has gained more geopolitical weight than before. Now we go to the historical question: what to do? So deal with it. And that's the most difficult one. I think it's important to recognize that Russia is and will remain our neighbor. We'll have to deal with Russia. under any circumstances, and it is not in our interest to see Russia's economy crumbling or collapsing, because we are so interdependent economically, especially in the global world. Secondly, it is of critical importance that the European Union stands firm, united and resolute behind the values we share and the principles we adhere, including support for territorial integrity and sovereignty of our common neighbour, Ukraine. Our relations with Russia can only change today if and when Minsk commitments are implemented and the Crimean annexation is tackled. And the situation in eastern Ukraine must stabilise. Regrettably, the situation is at worst point since August last year, and in view of the worsening situation, as you know, and recent escalation of fighting in the Donbas region, including shelling of the residential areas in Mariupol, the Council Foreign Affairs today will discuss the possibility to extend restrictive measures. We need to get our house in order. We need to keep our social economic European model sound and attractive, both for the EU citizens but also for our neighbours. We need to help Ukraine to succeed, supporting reforms and providing assistance where it's needed. We also must be realistic. Russia will not embrace the European liberal model anytime soon. It may be tilting towards the east or China for now. However, Russia remains a European country, though still, from my point of view, in a search of its own identity in a globalised, interdependent 21st century. For that, we also need talking on mutually interdependent issues. Energy is one, and Vice President Commissioner Šefčovič was the first to visit Russia after the Christmas break. We are talking, and Federica Mogherini had a telephone conversation over the weekend with her counterpart Sergei Lavrov, not only on Ukraine but also on the common foreign policy issues, and we're keen to promote people-to-people contacts, education, cultural exchanges and cross-border cooperation. I want to note that despite severe differences over Ukraine, we always maintain dialogue. And I want to put on the record my appreciation to the colleagues of Ambassador Chizhov, to the government officials, respective ministers and deputy ministers of foreign affairs for being accessible to me, but also to the high officials from the EAS and some member states to talk on such hot issues like Iran, Syria, Middle East, Afghanistan, and the dialogue will need to be furthered as we tackle the common interests, including such dangers which emanate from the Islamic State. As I mentioned, we are ready to maintain the dialogue with society at large as well. We worked last year over the Year of Science. We are rolling out a new programme of cross-border cooperation worth of 308 million euros. We will promote civil society contacts worth of 20 million euros, as well as education contacts. I see the Honourable Chairman is already showing me the sign that I have to stop talking about, not talking about dialogue, but about limiting my introductory remarks, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Herzlichen Dank. We had a lot of information, different arguments, and as I mentioned it, we have 20 speakers. You have only 1 minute time for your question, and I will start with Mr. Hala-Au. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair, but I have not indicated.
I think that's only two who ask for questions. Schaffhauser and Scholz. That's the two we ask for speaking, for questions.
Yes.
Yeah, it's only two for the moment.
The only two, not.
Yeah, not.
Okay. Mr. Schaffhauser.
Monsieur l'ambassadeur, vous devez représenter l'Union et en tant que représentant de l'Union, vous devez être le porte-parole de l'ensemble des pays et non pas le porte-parole de votre pays, la Lituanie. Donc vous avez dans vos propos un langage plutôt agressif qui ne correspond pas au langage de la France, ni de l'Italie, ni même au langage de Madame Mogherini. Donc je vous demande un peu de retenue, Monsieur l'ambassadeur. Ça, c'est la première remarque que j'aurai à faire. La deuxième remarque que j'aurai à faire, les sanctions ne sont pas seulement illégitimes, elles sont illégales. Nous engagerons d'ailleurs une procédure sur l'illégalité de ces sanctions. Elles sont illégales, elles ne tiennent pas au niveau du droit européen. Elles ne sont pas conformes à notre droit et à l'état de droit. Ma troisième remarque sont les actions concernant les ONG. Monsieur l'ambassadeur, vous voulez parler de Monsieur Soros? En 1995, quand j'avais rencontré Monsieur Kouchma, déjà la fondation Soros cherchait à couper l'Ukraine en deux. Quand vous parlez de complot, oui, il y avait un complot. Oui, il y a effectivement une volonté de couper l'Europe en deux et de se servir de l'Ukraine. Et oui, il y a des pays comme les vôtres qui soutiennent un tel projet. J'en suis désolé. Mais ne parlez pas au niveau de l'Union. Vous n'êtes pas le porte-parole de l'Union.
Danke, Herr Vorsitzender. Ich bin ja nicht Mitglied dieser Delegation, aber nehme an der Beratung heute teil, weil ich glaube, wir sind in einer sehr sensitiven Situation der Beziehung zwischen der Europäischen Union und der Russischen Föderation. Als Mitglied des Komitees für internationalen Handel bewegen mich natürlich gerade auch Fragen der wirtschaftlichen Kooperation und der Auswirkung der Sanktionspolitik auf die Menschen in beiden sozusagen Regionen, also Eurasische Union als auch Europäische Union. Und ich glaube, im 40. Jahrestag der Organisation für Sicherheit und Zusammenarbeit in Europa halte ich es für unbedingt wichtig, dass wir uns noch einmal den Gründungsgedanken damals der KSZE vor Augen führen, als die 3 Körbe entwickelt wurden. Das heißt, wir brauchen die Zusammenarbeit, wir brauchen einen Dialog, wir brauchen Verständnis, wie Staaten miteinander kooperieren können im Feld der allgemeinen Sicherheit, der politischen Beziehungen, zweitens im Bereich der wirtschaftlichen Zusammenarbeit und drittens in dem wichtigen Teil der Menschenrechte. Und das greift natürlich auch in die interne Verfasstheit von Staaten, aber auch die Fähigkeit, miteinander einen Dialog aufzusetzen, der deutlich macht, hier gibt es ein gemeinsames Interesse. Und deshalb die Frage vielleicht an beide Gäste und dieser heutigen Beratung. Wo würden Sie zum gegenwärtigen Zeitpunkt einen Einstiegsmechanismus sehen, genau unter dem Anknüpfungspunkt an den OSZE-Gedanken, der deutlich macht, was ist eigentlich das strategische Interesse in der bilateralen Kooperation? Ist es nur das bilaterale Interesse von wirtschaftlichen Unternehmungen, Profite im jeweils anderen Wirtschaftsgebiet zu realisieren? Was durchaus einen Sinn macht, weil ja auch die Grundidee der europäischen Einigung war, durch die wirtschaftliche Verflechtung es unmöglich zu machen, dass wieder Krieg zwischen Staaten entsteht. Ich komme gleich zum Ende, Herr Vorsitzender. Das wäre also der Punkt, der mich wirklich umtreibt. Und zweitens zur Energie. Im Gegenwart, das Europäische Parlament debattiert gerade die Fragen der Energiesicherheit bis zum Jahr 2030. Und dort wird natürlich die Frage der künftigen Zusammenarbeit mit der Russischen Föderation eine entscheidende Rolle spielen. Deshalb die Frage an den Vertreter des EAD. Sind Sie der Meinung, dass die russischen Energielieferungen heute Instabilität bewirken könnten innerhalb der Europäischen Union? Oder ist nicht auch die bisherige Erfahrung, dass zumindest bislang diese Energiestabilität gewährleistet war? Danke.
Herzlichen Dank. Ich habe zuerst einen Fehler gemacht, weil die Liste, die man mir zur Seite gelegt hat, war nicht die Speakersliste. Ich habe nur die beiden Anfragen zuerst gehabt. Das nächste ist zu Wort gemeldet die stellvertretende Vorsitzende.
Kiitoksia puheenjohtaja. Puheenjohtaja, teidän äidinkielessänne saksan kielessä on mainio sana Vergangenheitsbewältigung, pitkä, mutta erittäin tärkeä sana, että monet ongelmat johtuvat siitä, että se mitä aikaisemmin on tapahtunut, niin ei ole kunnolla selvitetty. Ja herra suurlähettiläs, te mainitsitte tässä Berliinin muurin murtumisen jälkeisen mahdollisuuden menettämisen siitä, että luodaan tämmöinen yhteinen humanitaarinen alue. Ja kun tätä historian kohtaa aukaisee tarkemmin, niin yleensä aina se, joka Venäjän puolelta on noussut keskustelun kohteeksi ja tämän päivän ongelmaksi, on Naton laajentuminen. Ja mun kysymys on se, että siihen mihin suurlähettiläs vieressäni mainitsi, se suuri periaate alueellisesta koskemattomuudesta ja jokaisen maan suvereniteetista tehdä omia poliittisia ratkaisuja, niin eikö nämä ole asioita, jotka pitää erittäin keskeisenä myös tänä päivänä. Ja toinen kysymys liittyy tähän, mitä aivan oikein korostitte, että käytännön kansalaisjärjestön ja muuta semmoista ikään kuin pragmaattista yhteistyötä, niin vielä kysyisin tästä, että miten te näette nytten, tuleeko mahdollisesti tästä pitkittymistä ongelmia, ja toivottavasti ei tule, niin esimerkiksi arktiselle yhteistyölle tai pohjoisen ulottuvuuden idealle, josta on oikeasti ollut suuria hyötyjä sekä yhteistyön kannalta että ihan konkreettisesti kansalaisten kannalta.
Thank you. Mr. Korwin-Mikke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, as a matter of fact, the foundation of European security had been shaken in 1999 when American planes had bombed Belgrade. Even during Joseph McCarthy's times, American Communist Party was free to act, but as it was accepting money from Soviet Union, it had to be registered as a foreign agency. 10 years ago, I was reading the memorial papers. They were doing a fantastic job. And my only bitter remark was that it documented the Stalinist atrocities, neglecting the much greater Leninist ones. But well, one can always create memorial bis. But when I was reading through the paper produced by Memorial half a year ago, I was shocked. They were just political pamphlets engaged in the present politics, unfortunately unilateral. I had checked. Well, Memorial is accepting money from the foreign powers, hostile to the Kremlin politics. So we cannot be shocked that Kremlin is treating Memorial as a hostile organization. Money can derail everything. It is sad but obvious.
Also ich muss Ihnen jetzt schon sagen, dass das, was Sie hier sagen, nicht den Tatsachen entspricht und dass Memorial keine Organisation ist, die Geld vom Ausland bekommt und unabhängig ihre Tätigkeit wahrnimmt und die älteste Menschenrechtsorganisation ist, wo deren Gründer der Herr Sacharow ist, der bei uns auch noch den Sacharow-Preis erhalten hat. Und dieses Parlament unterstützt zu 100% die Tätigkeit von Memorial. Und zu Ihrer Frage, unsere erste Wortmeldung, ich muss Ihnen schon sagen, Ihre Wortmeldung war Häuser aggressiver als die Erklärungen, die sachliche Analyse des Herrn Botschafters in Moskau. Ich habe hier nie unterschieden zwischen denen, die sich zu Wort melden, können sich zu Wort melden. Aber ich muss dem widersprechen, wann hier ein Angriff gemacht wird, was nicht der Tatsache entspricht. Bitte, Herr Wojciechowski, Sie waren am Wort.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie przewodniczący.
Trzy krótkie kwestie. Po pierwsze, panie ambasadorze, zwracam się do pana ambasadora Czyżowa. Dziękuję za pańską odpowiedź na mój list. Moje zapytanie dotyczące stanu śledztwa rosyjskiego w odniesieniu do katastrofy w Smoleńsku. Ale jednego nie rozumiem. Od 5 lat polska prokuratura prosi o zwrot wraku i czarnych skrzynek, ważnych dowodów. Prokuratura rosyjska te dowody przetrzymuje. Stanowią one polską własność. Myślę, że strona rosyjska miała już dość czasu, 5 lat, na zbadanie tych dowodów, które są bardzo potrzebne polskiej prokuraturze i w tym zakresie nie rozumiem postępowania strony rosyjskiej i apeluję o to, żeby ono się zmieniło. Druga kwestia to ostatnio ukazały się filmy pokazujące, jak w Doniecku, w tym terenie objętym konfliktem, traktowani są jeńcy ukraińscy, ludzie bezbronni, związani. Panie ambasadorze, tak się zachowują pańscy rodacy, na które władze rosyjskie chyba mają jednak jakiś wpływ. Więc to wystawia złe świadectwo już nie tylko w związku z tym konfliktem, ale w ogóle kulturze rosyjskiej, która jest wysoką kulturą, którą oceniam wysoko i takie zachowania wobec bezbronnych ludzi nie powinny mieć miejsca, urągają jakiejś podstawowym normom człowieczeństwa. Prosiłbym o interwencję w tej sprawie władze pańskiego kraju. I trzecia kwestia, mówiąc o tym, co się dzieje w Doniecku, czy pan ambasador nie dostrzega jednak podwójnych standardów? Kiedy mieliśmy konflikt w Czeczenii, Rosja jednoznacznie stawiała tę sprawę jako wewnętrzną sprawę Rosji, bo konflikt dział się na terytorium Rosji, Federacji Rosyjskiej. Dlaczego nie przyznaje pan tego samego prawa Ukrainie? Przecież to się dzieje na terytorium suwerennego państwa ukraińskiego. Dziękuję bardzo.
Gibt es im Moment weitere Wortmeldungen? Wenn dem nicht der Fall ist, möchte ich noch 2 Punkte aus meiner Sicht anschneiden. Sie haben gesagt, im Zusammenhang mit Memorial, durch die Entscheidung des obersten Gerichtshofes ist die Sache erledigt. Heißt das, dass Memorial auch von der Liste genommen wird, die sich als Organisation, als Agent bezeichnen soll? Denn das wäre, wenn Sie sagen, es ist damit alles erledigt, sind alle Einschränkungen und Auflagen gegenüber der Tätigkeit von Memorial damit mit erledigt? Oder ist nur die Frage des Verbotes erledigt? Denn es gibt ja weitere Einschränkungen oder Verpflichtungen von Memorial. Ich wollte Sie nur fragen, wie Sie das interpretieren. Der zweite Punkt ist, wir haben zwischen beiden Rednern unterschiedliche Interpretationen der Vorgänge und auch jeder hat versucht, die Sichtweise des anderen mitzuerklären. Faktum ist, dass es aber auf unserer Seite hier, und das hat der Herr Botschafter gesagt, der Hauptpunkt ist, dass wir der Auffassung sind, das Völkerrecht und die internationalen Verträge gebrochen wurden. Sowohl das Völkerrecht als auch die Helsinker Schlussakte. Und dass das die Ursache ist der Verschärfung der Situation. Wenn wir keine Basis finden auf dem Boden von gemeinsamen Verträgen und auf dem Boden gemeinsam unterschriebener Friedensvereinbarungen wie der Minsker Übereinkommen, ist es sehr schwer, zur Tagesordnung überzugehen und den Dialog zu führen. Nämlich gar nicht möglich. Daher sage ich ja, der entscheidende und Sie sagen, wir sind alle Mitglieder der OECD. Wir alle machen Fehler, aber Wir stehen auf dieser Grundlage. Wenn Sie auf dieser Grundlage stehen, wenn wir darauf stehen, dann hätte es das, was auf der Krim passiert ist und das, was derzeit in der Ostukraine geschieht, nicht geben dürfen. Und wenn es gibt, müssen wir beide dazu beitragen, dass das sozusagen beseitigt wird. Und in diesem Zustand sind wir nicht. Und daher reden wir immer um den heißen Brei herum. Und meine große Frage ist, wie schaffen wir es, dass wir keinen Zweifel haben und nicht unterschiedliche Interpretationen der Einhaltung des Minsker Abkommens, der Einhaltung des Völkerrechts, die Implementierung des Protokolls von Helsinki. Da darf es keinen Zweifel zwischen uns geben. Dann kann man über alles andere streiten und Meinungsverschiedenheiten haben. Aber es gibt derzeit eine unterschiedliche Interpretation von gesetztem Recht, dem wir uns beide verpflichtet haben, sowohl in der Frage unserer Mitgliedschaft bei den Vereinten Nationen, unserer gemeinsamen Mitgliedschaft beim Europarat, unserer gemeinsamen Mitgliedschaft aller Mitgliedstaaten und Russland bei der OECD. Hier gibt es eine Rechtsbasis, die derzeit nicht eingehalten wird. Und Sie haben, das ist doch die Hauptursache des Problems. Und militärische Interventionen kann man nicht begründen. Die muss man unterlassen. Und man muss schauen, dass wir wieder zu einer friedlichen Situation kommen, damit die Menschen nicht die Opfer dieser Konfrontation sind. Bitte, Herr Botschafter.
Thank you. Let me address the questions in the order they were raised. Yeah. Is that audible? Okay. Let me see. Okay. On the memorial ruling, well, to give you a properly worded answer, I'll need to check with the text of the decision of the Supreme Court, and I will send you a written reply, if I may. Because, well, I'm not a lawyer, but I understand how important terminology and actual phrasing of decisions is. On the Smolensk tragedy, the question by Mr. Wojciechowski. Actually, you are correct mentioning that Polish prosecutors have been closely collaborating with Russian prosecutors for almost 5 years now. And actually the number of requests for information and additional data coming from the Polish side is, well, numbers dozens and dozens, which is, of course, adding to the burden of work of the Russian investigators. As soon as the investigation is over, all the material evidence, the remains of the aircraft, will be certainly handed over to the Polish side officially and in full. But according to normal rules of any investigation, this cannot be done before the investigation is over. On videos posted on internet, let me advise you and everybody else to be careful against taking whatever you see on internet for granted. On Russian abuses, well, Russian abuses, I presume, is supported by certain insignia on certain uniforms on certain individuals appearing on those certain blogs on the internet. That is not hard evidence. Actually, let me say one thing. There have been many statements coming from various quarters, from NATO to Poroshenko, or vice versa, about 9,000 Russian military, ostensibly, regular military, ostensibly fighting in eastern Ukraine. And actually with every defeat that the Ukrainian army is suffering at the hands of the Donetsk and Lugansk forces, this number tends to grow. I have taken due note of the descriptions of the current state of the Russian army as, being impressive, having modernized, acquired modern weapons and equipment. But let me assure you, the Russian army is not the army of the future yet, which can make its soldiers invisible. Can you ask yourself the question, if there is Russian military presence in eastern Ukraine, why no single unit, no single soldier has been spotted as evidence? Why none has been taken a prisoner? Why none have been killed in eastern Ukraine? With all due respect to the Soldiers' Mothers Committee, not exactly, but in many respects, it is a very emotion-driven organization rather than hard fact-driven. Now, the next question, yes, on double standards between Donetsk and Chechnya. Actually, on this, let me stress officially, there are no double standards on the Russian side. We regard what is happening in Donetsk as an internal conflict within Ukraine. The same phraseology that you applied to events in Chechnya years ago. It is an internal conflict, and we consider those people fighting against the Ukrainian army and the so-called volunteer battalions as Ukrainian citizens fighting for their rights, because their rights have been trampled on after the coup d'etat of last February. And however you look at the Maidan and the protests, what happened on the 22nd of February 2014 is, by all definitions, a coup d'etat. And naturally, the people in the eastern part of the country who saw that the so-called government of winners, which was created instead of the promised national unity government in Kiev, was not reflecting their interests and was acting against them. So they had the logical and I would say very understandable need to protect their own rights. And if you look back, you will see that when this rift between Kiev and the Donbass started, people in the East, they were not talking about independence or, fighting a war. The only thing they opted for was federalization of Ukraine. And nothing beyond that. They didn't want to leave Ukraine. Whereas the reaction from the newly established authorities in Kiev was such, with the evident attempt to crush this, the East by force, and this policy has not been abandoned until today, that this situation deteriorated, unfortunately, to a full-blown violent conflict. Now, on Crimea, yes, on one small thing, let me correct you. Russia is not a member of the OECD.
No, OECD.
Yeah, well, perhaps the interpreters missed that. Russia has applied to join the OECD, but it is EU member states that have blocked this accession process. The OSCE, sure. International law regarding Crimea. Well, however you look at it, the events in Crimea evolved in full compliance with international law, and I state that quite officially. They had a parliament elected in 2012, I think, a local regional parliament, which voted by a vast majority of votes to hold a referendum. That referendum was held and was recognized as such by Russia, by those international observers that were present, several members of the European Parliament among them. And that referendum declared independence of Crimea and Sevastopol. Then, on the basis of this referendum result, they voted to apply to join the Russian Federation. That application was approved. In practical terms, this, well, you call it annexation for some reason, which I failed to understand. But this was a perfectly democratic procedure, unlike many others that have been taking place across Europe in the last decades. Finally, on the Minsk agreements, let me assure you, well, let me again draw your attention to the fact that the Minsk agreements became a reality on the initiative of President Putin, who on the 3rd of September outlined the basic elements in public. Then he conferred with President Poroshenko, who added some on his own part, and that, as their joint initiative, became the substance of the Minsk Protocol. Unfortunately, many elements of this protocol and the subsequent memorandum of the 19th of September, which was a memorandum on implementation of the protocol, they were not adhered to by the Ukrainian government, including the promised law on special status for Donbass. Yes, the law was voted in, but was never enacted and then withdrawn. On the amnesty law, who has heard about it anything? It was never on the cards. Humanitarian aid, economic rehabilitation of the region. Instead of that, industrial enterprises are continuously shelled and bombed by the Ukrainian army. Only a few days ago, the largest coal mine in Donbass was shelled. The electricity supply was severed, and 300 miners were left down there. Yes, you could say à la guerre comme à la guerre, but this is a war against their own people. I'm sorry to see how selective the reaction to what's happening in Donbass we're witnessing here in Brussels and elsewhere, even at the United Nations. Whenever the Ukrainian president and the Ukrainian government ask for support, which was the case, for example, with the shelling of the yellow bus in Volnovakha, even a march of solidarity resembling the one in Paris. But when 2 or 3 days later, a trolley bus stop was shelled in central Donetsk, as if it didn't happen. That is something that I would call double standards. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I think it's required to make a clarification about what happened, what did not happen yesterday, and we indeed welcome yesterday's Supreme Court's ruling against the Ministries of Justice claims against Russian Memorial as an umbrella organization. And there were some discrepancies when it comes to the compliance to the Russian law, which Russian Memorial Organization umbrella has amended, and now the Supreme Court has ruled out that umbrella organization complies to the Russian legislation. However, when it comes to the Human Rights Center Memorial, which is a different organization, it has been included into the Ministry of Justice Foreign Agents Registry, and there were no changes in that respect, so the Human Rights Center Memorial has not been revoked from the foreign agents list, and actually, notwithstanding statements by Ombudsman Pamfilova and by the Civic Chamber of Russia, no changes have yet been introduced into the foreign agents law. When it comes to other questions, first of all, Honourable Schaffhauser, I take your note. We were present in democratic chamber, and that's one of the gifts of the democracy and the parliamentary debate. Despite what you said, I do enjoy full confidence and support of the 28 EU member states and the EU leadership, as well as respected as EU representative in the Russian Federation by Russian authorities. I'm proud to be Lithuanian. I'm also proud to represent 20 EU member states. What I did today, I restated EU position, EU formal positions, and also shared with you my account on the current state of affairs. Don't choose a messenger. What is important is that we hear and listen to each other, as we do it with the Russians among ourselves, so as to better understand and realistically grasp the differences, the difficulties and opportunities we have as we move forward in overcoming the deepest and the most serious security challenge, and the differences between two interdependent partners such as Russia and the EU. I'm particularly interested, to dwell more upon Mr. Scholz's questions on what is a way out of the crisis, what are the exit avenues, whether the economic agenda could be the one. Yes, we know from the history of our continent of Europe that economic integration served the way towards peace, stability and security. European Union's official position that we are committed to that, Ambassador Chizhov mentioned briefly about the long-term idea of common spaces of free trade agreement between EU and Russia from Vladivostok and
EU and the Eurasian
from Vladivostok to Lisbon. However you're going to place it. It's something what European Union is open to consider. It's something we believe would be beneficial for our economic and political actors. But the real question is upon which foundations we're going to build. The real question is whether we're going to observe the international rules-based system, political and economic, whether we'll respect the territorial integrity of our neighbors, also important economic actors. It's important whether Russia is ready to embrace free trade and to provide market access unrestricted. And last but not least, we can only discuss great economic integration when we see trade barriers which were introduced removed. and that our partners comply to the WTO provisions. We remain hostage of the Ukraine crisis, and that is why the European Union's position is that we need to do our utmost to honour the commitments of the Minsk, and that's what's going to be discussed today by the Foreign Affairs Council, and that's where we continue to talk to the Russian Federation on other foreign policy issues. Whether Arctic collaboration and Nordic collaboration might be affected, I hope not, but I also must confess that I've just got a news the day before yesterday that the Nordic Council in St. Petersburg was also labelled as a foreign agent. Hopefully it will not have negative repercussions for its activities and concrete development programmes. So with this, I appreciate for the open, frank exchange. I look forward to continue to stay in touch with all of you and look to the day when I can welcome you in Moscow.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. Point of order. But I wanted to withdraw your words that I'm not telling truth. You must withdraw your words. Mr. Chairman. If you get money from abroad,
Ich würde Folgendes ersuchen, um die Frage Memorial abzuschließen. Die Interpretation. Ich würde sehr darum ersuchen, dass man das Urteil so versteht, dass Memorial die Menschenrechtsorganisation auch von der Liste des Außenministeriums gestrichen wird, um den Raum für die Tätigkeit zu erweitern und nicht einzuschränken. Herzlichen Dank. Wir sehen uns wieder am